All right. Morning, everyone. All right. So today we can finally begin talking about knowledge. Now, last time, we'll go over the recap here, and I'll say a little bit about um, kind of how last week sets up this week, or perhaps doesn't set up this week. Where are my slides? There are my slides. Okay. Yeah, so glad to see everybody's filtering into the classroom, the virtual classroom that is. I hope everyone had a good weekend. I had a busy weekend myself. I'm getting ready to do virtual reality at the Ottawa International Animation Festival this week, which is always a blast. And but it means that I'm kind of pulling double duty right now. But I believe the passes for the festival are a little pricey, but if you do have the spare cash, it is kind of a really neat thing. It's actually the largest animation festival in the world. And I like to do it because um, I like animation, but also my research has a little bit to do with how we perceive animacy with when it comes to human-like artifacts, such as social robots and stuff like that. So there's actually a little bit of overlap there. So it's cool for two reasons, for me at least. But the point is, might be a little sleepy this week. Now, for recap, let me just get myself out of the way here. So last week we were talking about skepticism. You'll recall that we covered two of Rene Descartes' skeptical arguments. Now remember, Rene Descartes is not a skeptic himself. Rather, he is trying to formulate the strongest arguments that he can, the strongest skeptical arguments that he can, and then refute them so that he can be certain in his knowledge. And the two that we looked at were the dream argument and the demon argument. So the first is the argument that we cannot trust the senses, not because they deceive us occasionally. That's important. It's not because occasionally we're mistaken about reality on the basis of the senses. Rather, the point of the dream argument is that we trust our sense experiences, but our dream experiences are a lot like our sense experiences of the world, but our dream experiences are not reliable. Oh, my dog is barking at a dog outside. One moment. Tula, come here. Come here. Come here, you. Stop barking. Yeah, so I think that when I'm awake and perceiving everything, I'm perceiving stuff out there in the real world. But I believe the same thing when I'm dreaming. And in fact, when I'm dreaming, it's not objects in the world that are the causes of my experience, but rather something in my mind. So I should not trust the senses, Descartes says, to reveal the world as it really is. And the demon argument is, of course, that there could be a malicious entity that could make me mistaken about even things that I think are like a priori necessary truths, such as triangles having three sides. I could be mistaken about that because of this evil genius or this demon. Then we looked at David Hume and what he has to say about enumerative induction. We talked, of course, about the the circularity there is when it comes to the uniformity principle. The uniformity principle here means that nature is the same everywhere, so the future should be like the past. But if I'm relying on something like the uniformity principle, I'm doing it on the basis of induction. And the certainty of induction is kind of what we set out to establish. So it's circular. Hey, stop barking, you. This is my dog, everyone. She likes to bark. Stop barking, okay? Okay. So, that's it for recap. Yeah, yeah. Whenever I lecture from home, I try to have my pupper join us. She is cute, but she's loud. Aren't you? Aren't you? Huh? Why are you barking? I'm teaching. I'm teaching philosophy right now. Okay, lie down. Go lie down. Oh, okay. Guess we're having a pupper lecture today. So, we want to turn toward knowledge today. What are you doing? We're going to talk about knowledge. Oh, now she's trying to eat the cat food. Oh, dogs, am I right? Okay, so we're talking about knowledge. So last week, how last week's materials kind of set us up is that we talked about skepticism, right? Inquiry, or in a more modern colloquial sense, to doubt. We're uncertain what we can know, or we're trying to get to what we can know by applying a skeptical approach. And now we're going to talk about knowledge itself. So, what exactly is it? How do we know when we have it? That's actually going to be for Wednesday's lecture. But today we're going to learn a little bit about uh, two philosophical traditions, each of which differ um, when it comes to their claims about knowledge. And those traditions are rationalism and empiricism. And of course, we've already met some rationalist philosophers. Rene Descartes is a rationalist. In fact, he's kind of like the father of modern rationalism in the European tradition. When I say modern, the modern period here is like after the Renaissance. So Rene Descartes is a 17th century philosopher, or 17th, right? I almost forget. I'm so bad with dates. The point is he is the first proper modern philosopher, or he's often treated that way, and he's also the first modern rationalist. David Hume, on the other hand, is a thoroughgoing empiricist, right? He believed that knowledge comes via the senses. And that's really one of the main differences here. We'll talk a little bit more about a priori and a posteriori knowledge today. Oh, excuse me, as well. So here we have this image here is from a fresco by Raphael called The School of Athens. And it depicts Plato and Aristotle. Now, I'm curious, do any of you know which one is Plato and which one is Aristotle? Go ahead and let us know in the chat or raise your hand if you know. Yeah, yeah, Plato's on the left. Plato is older. That's true. Good. Good. Yeah, you've all got it. An interesting thing about the symbolism in this in this fresco, Plato is pointing up. Plato is the idealist, the rationalist. And yeah, Plato was Aristotle's teacher. So Plato's pointing up. As we'll see, Plato believes in these pure forms, which are more real. Oh, I'm on the wrong slide here. Plato is pointing up. Aristotle is pointing down at the world. Plato is a rationalist, probably one of the first rationalists in the Western tradition. And Aristotle's really more of an empiricist. Certainly not the first empiricist, because Prior to the classical period in ancient Greece, the classical period is defined by the work of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. You had a group of philosophers called the pre-Socratic, so just the philosophers that came before Socrates. And they were really something like scientists, and not all of them, but many of them spent a lot of time out in the world just observing things. So Plato, one of the first rationalists, Aristotle, an early empiricist, but not the first one. That's why Plato's pointing up and Aristotle's pointing down. I'll clarify more about why Plato points up in a moment. But these two each believed that we could have genuine knowledge. They were not skeptics, right? Genuine knowledge was possible. And when we have knowledge, it's always knowledge of a universal truth, something that is true throughout the universe. Now, why is Plato a rationalist? He believes that knowledge is attained using the intellect or reason, or as the ancient Greeks would have called it, logos. Logos is an ancient Greek word that means reason, rationality, especially in language. So that's what Plato thinks we do. We come to knowledge using the internet, the intellect. Aristotle believed that we attain a knowledge using the senses and sense experience. This divide has continued throughout Western philosophy for over 2,000 years now. So Plato here, why is he pointing up? Because he believes that when we apprehend the pure forms or ideas with the intellect, that's when we have knowledge. Now, what are the forms? Some of you who have taken a philosophy class before may be familiar with the forms or the ideas. Does anyone want to take a crack at explaining what they are? If you do, you can raise your hand or simply use the chat. Maybe nobody wants to volunteer. That's okay. So the forms, oh, Jose, yes. I think the forms are ideals, non-physical and non-changing. That's exactly right. And importantly, they're also the most real thing for Plato. They're more real than the world of appearances, the world we experience via the senses. Some of you may have heard of the allegory of the cave, right? I mentioned this, I think, in my discussion of the Matrix. Although I could be mistaken. I could be getting my other class mixed up with this one. Yeah, essentially, Aristotle thinks of what Plato would have called a form as a universal. Yeah. Aristotle talks a lot about universals, but you're right, in the textbook, yeah, something like a number and even number itself. That's right. So Plato was trained in the Pythagorean tradition. So Pythagoras, you've probably all heard of the Pythagorean theorem, right? Pythagoras thought that we could understand the cosmos in terms of number, geometry, harmonia or harmony between numbers and stuff. So Plato's educated in that tradition. So, he's thinking to himself as he's working on all this geometry, I can draw all these polygons in the sand or on a slate, and they're all triangles and squares and so forth. But I have this idea that I've grasped with the intellect of a perfect triangle with perfectly straight lines, perfect angles. Maybe it's a right triangle, so it's a perfect 90-degree angle, and then two perfect 45-degree angles. It's just a perfect triangle that doesn't exist in nature, but that I can grasp with the intellect. That's like a form. And Plato believes there are forms for everything. For numbers, for shapes, for objects like cups and tables, and even for abstract concepts like beauty or justice or the good. Everything has a form, and our world are like, the things in our world are like shadows cast by the forms that are more real, more pure, and exist in this sort of world of pure being. We grasp those with the intellect. And when we do that, that's when we have knowledge. Yeah. Yeah, Plato thought, yeah, both of those are actually right, Jose. Like it's a perfect version of an object, but it would some like they could also be thought of as what we would think of as concepts, as if concepts existed out there in some kind of perfect realm of ultimate reality, right? In fact, Plato's sort of creation myth is that God, who is like this demiurge or craftsman, makes the cosmos using the forms that are also eternal and perfect. Um, and there are Neoplatonic philosophers or Neoplatonist philosophers like Saint Augustine. Um, they agreed with Plato. Here's what Saint Augustine says: whatever is attained by sense, what we call the sensible, never for an instant ceases to change. Always it is in a state of uninterrupted becoming, and the perpetually changing cannot be comprehended. No genuine truth, and hence no knowledge, can be had by the senses. So that's pretty straightforwardly rationalist, right? So we can only grasp, according to thinkers like Plato or St. Augustine, we can only grasp what is unchangeable, the forms. We can only grasp necessary truths. That's true knowledge. So another thing about rationalists is they talk a lot about what we call the natural light of the reason, natural light of reason. These universal truths that are grasped by the intellect. We also make the analogy of a light that the mind, that our reason illuminates these things for us to see. So Saint Augustine here, you can see, called this the light of the mind, and thinkers like Descartes or Leibniz, who we don't encounter in this chapter, they called it the natural light of reason. It's sort of supposed to be this just like God-given power, the thing that separates us from the animals, as it were. So reason alone allows us to have knowledge. That's what rationalists say, and most rationalists say the senses mislead us about the nature of reality. They don't tell us the way reality is. But if you're an empiricist like Aristotle, all knowledge begins with the senses. And St. Thomas Aquinas, a medieval philosopher and theologian, agreed. He says, the philosopher proves that the principle of our knowledge is in the senses. He's talking about Aristotle here. Thomas Aquinas was a thoroughgoing Aristotelian. He calls him the philosopher, as if there are no other philosophers, right? So if you're reading Aquinas and he says the philosopher, you know he's talking about Aristotle. So if you're an empiricist, you still believe that we can come to know things about universal truths. But we do this because everything begins with the senses. Sure, we use reason. It's not like we don't use reason. But we need the senses in order to acquire our concepts. And once we get past that start, we can use reason to look at the world the way a scientist does and learn truths about the world that way. But we can also draw a clearer distinction between rational and empiricism if we consider a priori knowledge. So remember, this is knowledge that is prior to sense experience. As we'll see today, this is sort of what we're going to be talking about today. Rationalists and empiricists like Descartes on the one hand or Hume on the other, who are working in the 17th and 18th centuries, debated a priori knowledge quite a bit. And there was some interesting discussion. Oh, excuse me. Oh, I'm yawning a lot today. There's some interesting discussion and debate concerning a priori knowledge in the 20th century, which is where we'll hopefully finish up today if we have time. And if we take a look at the nature of some of these debates, it's going to help us distinguish a little bit better between rationalists and empiricists and what they have to say about knowledge, other than the former claiming that the source of knowledge is the intellect, and the latter claiming that it's the senses. So remember, one source of a priori knowledge is the intellect. So we can reflect and contemplate, we can just think about things, and we can grasp some universal truths that way. A big idea not mentioned in the textbook, but a big one here, is that some knowledge is innate. That means it's present from birth. So Plato, and I realize we're not reading any of Plato's dialogues in this class, which is somewhat of a shame. But in certain of his dialogues, he has the character Socrates argue that knowledge is actually a matter of recollection. Plato, you see, believed that when we died, the soul will go off out of the body and exist in that realm of pure being with the perfect forms, so that we know the forms via the intellect alone. Because for Plato, the soul and the mind are the same thing. There's no difference for Plato, right? Then we're kind of like later we're kind of re-embodied. It's almost like reincarnation, right? The theory is actually called the transmigration of the soul. So Plato believes that our souls have encountered the pure forms before, then we have innate knowledge about them. But because of the trauma of birth, we forget this knowledge. So what you need to do is recollect your knowledge, and you do this by doing philosophy, by having somebody ask you the right questions. If you're curious about this, check out Plato's dialogue, the Meno, and you'll see what I mean. Likewise, Descartes thinks that some knowledge is innate. In particular, he thinks that knowledge about God is innate. That and this is one of his ontological arguments for the existence of God. Again, I don't want to get ahead of myself, because we're going to be covering these kinds of arguments in the final chapter. But one of Descartes' arguments for the existence of God is that he is an imperfect being, but he has this concept of a perfect being, namely God. And an imperfect being could not conceptualize something so perfect, so it must have been put there by God. So that's also a kind of innate knowledge. So innate knowledge is another sort of mark of rationalism, but it's not the one we're going to focus on. We're going to focus on a priori knowledge. And a priori truths are supposed to be necessary truths. That means they have to be true. No matter what, they will be true. They're true no matter what happens, no matter what kinds of changes and physical processes affect our world. Triangles will always have three sides, right? In fact, a priori truths, these necessary truths, must be true in every possible world. That means every logically possible world. So when philosophers say possible world, they're not talking about like the multiverse, like a physicist might. They're talking about worlds where things could have been otherwise. Just logically speaking, I could have not been a philosophy professor, right? I could have been something else. So that's a possible world. It doesn't mean there's another world out there where I'm, not a professor, where I'm still working my first job. All right, my first job was a garbage man, actually. So maybe there's a world where I'm a garbage man rather than a philosophy professor. Um, Maybe if multiverse theory is true, but philosophers aren't interested in whether that world actually exists. They're interested in whether things could have been otherwise. Necessary truths will be true no matter what otherwise could have been. So it couldn't, if something is necessarily true, it could not otherwise have been false in another possible world. So a priori knowledge is knowledge that you have prior to sense experience. So things you can know without going out and observing the world. So all triangles have three sides is a sentence that you can know is true independent of sense experience because it's like definitionally true that all triangles have three sides. But a question like how many triangles are in your house? Maybe the front of your house by the roof has a triangle shape. You have to actually go and look to see, right? But a priori knowledge is always prior to sense experience, so you don't need to go and observe the world to know it. And a posteriori knowledge is the opposite. That's knowledge that you have once you've gone and observed the world. So I know that there is this coffee cup in front of me full of delicious coffee because I see it and I can smell the coffee. So my knowledge of this coffee cup is a posteriori, but my knowledge that all triangles have three sides and three internal angles that sum to 180 degrees, that is a priori knowledge. Does that help clear it up? No, it's not quite the same as multiverse theory because, okay, good. I'm glad that clears it up. It's not quite the same, right? Because a physicist might posit multiverse theory and claim that these other universes really exist. So that at the same time as I exist here, there are infinite other universes which are different than the one that we're in now. But for a philosopher, they're real that when they say a possible world, when they say possible worlds, they mean what could have been different in this world. So it's possible that maybe I didn't become a philosophy professor. That's right, Jose. That's right. So I think that addresses Mohammed's questions. Yeah. So a posteriori, remember, like a priori is cognate with the word prior, which means before, and a posteriori that's cognate with the word posterior, which means behind. So that's how you can remember. Yeah, no problem. So it's really just before or after sense experience. Where does the knowledge come from? Is it before sense experience or after sense experience? If it's before, a priori. If it's after, a posteriori. So once we've got the concepts that we need, reason alone will allow us, according to the rationalist, to grasp whether a proposition is true. And we call this the traditional view of a priori knowledge. Now, some of these truths are pretty straightforward, right? And we've covered a number of rather shop-worn examples by now, like all bachelors are unmarried or all squares have four sides. These are a priori truths. They're true because they're definitionally true, right? Bachelor just means unmarried male. If you claim to have found a married bachelor, that would be a contradiction. It wouldn't make sense. If someone is married, they're not a bachelor, right? If you find a square with five sides, well, that's not a square. It's a pentagon, right? It could be a regular or an irregular pentagon, but it's not a square, just by definition, because it doesn't have four sides. So these are sort of like linguistic a priori bits of knowledge. But some rationalists think that we can even grasp metaphysical truths via the exercise of reason alone. Metaphysical truth, remember, this is a metaphysics, mind, and epistemology class. Metaphysics, no, the bachelor thing is not, I'm not quite sure what you mean, but the definition of bachelors as unmarried males is not circular. But according to Quine, the whole idea that we understand analytic propositions might be circular. But we'll get there. So metaphysics, this is a word that has kind of weird connotations to it now in popular circles. For example, if you walk into the bookstore and you go into the New Age section, you'll see plenty books that claim to talk about metaphysics. They are not, right? Metaphysics is the study of reality. So it's like, what kinds of things exist? And what are the nature of the things that exist? That's metaphysics. Has nothing to do with what you might find in the metaphysics section of a bookstore or the New Age section of the bookstore, okay? So Saad says, if you don't understand the concept of the triangle, you wouldn't know that the triangles have three sides. And that's what an empiricist would say. An empiricist would say, hang on, Mr. Rationalist, you need sense experience to acquire these concepts. Aha, checkmate, right? So what the question you've asked there, it's very good. That's how an empiricist might respond to a rationalist. So yeah. It's a good question. And some would say, yeah, like once you have the concepts, you can use reason alone, but you need your senses to acquire those concepts. Discrepancy in the meaning of metaphysics. Well, I think it's just an interesting sounding word that some people have appropriated. I mean, originally it comes from Aristotle. Aristotle had a treatise called The Physics, which comes from the Greek physis, which means nature. So it was just on nature, just studying nature. And then in the complete works of Aristotle, the books that come after are just called the books that come after the physics. In Greek, that's what metaphysics would mean, after the physics. That's all it means. So he's looking at nature, and then he's looking at other things beyond nature itself, causality and stuff like that. That's metaphysics for Aristotle. That's where the word comes from. So a priori knowledge that is made evident based on systems such as math, vocabulary. Does the system have to be widely accepted? Well, in a sense, I guess it depends who you ask, right? Some people will say that mathematics itself was invented, and some will claim that it was discovered. By the way, whether somebody claims that math is invented or discovered will tell you what they think about knowledge. If someone claims that mathematics is invented, they're probably an empiricist, whether they know it or not. If they claim that mathematics is discovered, they might be a rationalist. But yeah, the systems should, if the systems are good systems, they should be widely accepted. So how can we know something is perfect or a form if everything is a human construct, since we make things up? Well, Plato and other rationalists would disagree. They would say, no, these things are not just in our minds. They're out there, and they're more real than the things in our world. That's what a rationalist would say. They would completely deny that. Sure, we invent the word triangle. but the idea of a triangle, a polygon with three sides and internal angles that sum to 180 degrees, might be something that's difficult to find in nature. But a rationalist would say it's not a human construct. It's something that exists out there metaphysically that we've discovered or grasped with the intellect, right? And not everything is a human construct. The worry there is something called relativism, right? The sort of like man is the measure of all things, right? Yeah, I would say that an empiricist, somebody with empiricist inclinations, would say that math is invented, perhaps. A rationalist would say it was discovered because we're discovering mathematical truths that are true independently of whether we know them or not, right? Yeah, well, that's a more concrete example, Casey, like with tool use. But you're right. I mean, other non-human animals use tools, and it's just kind of what they do, right? And we're probably the same. I mean, other apes use tools as well. So it's not like one day there was a caveman who was like, "Ooh, I discovered this tool." No, we've probably been doing it since before we were humans, right? Um, math system we invented. Yeah, this is what I would say, like Mayar, is as math is a system we invented that we can use to discover universal truths, kind of like science. Um, but a metaphysical truth might be something like all events have a cause. Other examples in the textbook are the self is a persistent thing, or God necessarily exists, or something, right? These are all um, metaphysical truths that a rationalist could claim to have grasped using reason alone. Yeah, I mean, that's fine. Like math, it depends. Yeah, like it's like, what are we talking about when we say math, right? Um, when people say that the truths of mathematics are discovered, but mathematics is invented, I think that means something like what you're saying here. Like we invented mathematics, like the procedures and the things, the mathematical tools that we use. But the things that we discover using math are universal truths, right? I think that's probably where most people um probably where most people sit on this, but there are some Platonists. Well, Newton didn't. I mean, I find it weird to say that anyone discovered gravity, because we're all here on the planet being held down by gravity, right? Um, but Newton did identify like the gravitational constant G, um, which was important. Definitely didn't invent it. I'm not sure about the pyramids thing, Danielle. Um, maybe I'll come back to that one. Yes, it was easy until Isaac Newton came along. Okay, I get it. Okay, so back to this. Another thing about rationalists. Remember that Rene Descartes offers his dream argument in an attempt to show us that the senses do not depict the world the way it really is. They don't reveal the true nature of reality, right? Sure, sometimes they deceive us, but that's not why they don't trust them. Rather, like Plato, the senses don't tell us about the true nature of the world. Plato would say the senses reveal phenomena. Phenomena is a word that means appearance. But at the intellect or reason, that is the exercise of our logos, enables knowledge of things in themselves, or noumena. In Plato's case, these are the forms or the ideas. And if you ever have the chance, if you want to go and read Descartes' meditations on first philosophy, in the second meditation, there's something called the wax exercise, where Descartes is sitting by the fire and he's meditating on what he can know and stuff. And he's got this chunk of beeswax that's solid, and he can tap it and it makes a sound, and it still smells a little bit like the flowers from which the honey was gathered. He was like, okay, this is my beeswax. But then he puts it by the fire, and of course it melts. So it goes from solid to liquid. The smell changes, it expands slightly. And he says, like, look, if you were relying on your senses, you would think that this is a different substance, right? A different body, that this piece of wax is not this puddle of wax. They can't be the same. But using the intellect, I grasp that it's the same wax, even though it's changed states. So that's another sort of, I guess, another way to show that the senses don't reveal reality, the true nature of reality. So do check out the wax exercise if you're curious. And if you want to read the meditations, it can be found online for free. Like different websites like Project Gutenberg and stuff, they have all these free books because they're all public domain, and you can just go to the website and read them. And the meditations are actually a pretty easy read, at least the first couple. They're quite short. And it's just Descartes, like, I'm sitting by the fire thinking about stuff, you know? It's just, it's very, very straightforward, very fun to read. Let's see, how are we doing for time? Hopefully we'll be all right. Now, so much for rationalism and a priori knowledge. What about empiricism? Oh, I keep yawning so much. Apologies, everyone. Now, an empiricist is probably going to tell you that reason alone does not guarantee knowledge of the world. Sure, there are some things that we can know a priori. Remember David Hume? He thought that every instance of a priori knowledge was actually knowledge of relations between ideas. Or in Crumley's words, such knowledge is always about necessary connections between concepts. Oh, so you're up early. That's rough. Geez, yeah, sorry about that. So, knowledge is always about necessary definitions, necessary connections between concepts. Um, yeah, yeah, that's rough. Reminds me of when I was in high school, and I lived out in the middle of nowhere. So the bus ride to school was very long. I had to get up at like 5 a.m. Just to make it to school on time. It was rough. But you could always nap a little bit on the bus, so that's kind of nice. So anyway, so what does this mean? Necessary connections between concepts. Well, take a sentence like all bachelors are unmarried men, right? That's true by definition. It doesn't tell us anything about the world, right? There's no empirical information in a sentence like that. So Hume would say that knowing something prior to sense experience is really just a matter of knowing the relations between the concepts involved. The concepts here are bachelors, being unmarried, men, so on and so forth, right? Now, the main disagreement between rationalists and empiricists is arguably the extent of a priori knowledge. A 20th century philosopher named A.J. Ayer advocated for something that we call the linguistic view of the a priori. Now, he thought that this undermines the motivations for rationalism. He wrote, "The fundamental tenet of rationalism is that thought is an independent source of knowledge. And the ground for this view is simply that the only necessary truths about the world which are known to us are known through thought and not through experience." So remember, a priori truths are necessary truths, and these truths are known through the intellect, not sense experience. So that if we can show either that the truths in question are not necessary, or that they are not truths about the world, we shall be taking away the support on which rationalism rests. So Ayer, definitely an empiricist. If we can show let's go back actually before we get to Kant. If we can show that the truths aren't necessary, so something like all bachelors are unmarried men, if we can show that that's not necessarily true, or that we can show that a priori truths are not truths about the world, then the rationalist has no legs to stand on. So now we come to Kant, who, I'm not going to lie, is complicated. What we're doing here is a sort of bare bones discussion of Kant. Now, of course, in the 17th and 18th centuries, you have the rationalists and the empiricists, right? You have rationalists like Descartes. I guess let's see, who else is a rationalist? Spinoza, Leibniz. You have those rationalists, and then you have your empiricists. Well, Hume's an empiricist. Likewise, John Locke, Thomas Hobbes. So it's like rationalists versus empiricists. A big debate. And along comes Immanuel Kant, who's like, you know what, guys? I got this. I'm going to take care of this. Don't worry about it. Oh, okay, that's no problem. So Kant argued for what he called a Copernican revolution in metaphysics. We'll explain what that means in a moment. Kant claimed that after reading Hume, namely Hume on causality, he was awakened from a quote unquote dogmatic slumber. Now, Hume says that we can know a priori truths because we have the concepts associated with what the words in those sentences mean, right? So sentences that assert these connections between concepts like bachelor and unmarried man, we can know a priori those truths. That's what Hume would say, and Kant actually agrees with them there. Actually, Kant calls these analytic propositions. So an analytic proposition is a proposition. Remember, a proposition is a sentence that says something about the world, and it can be true or false. And an analytic proposition has the predicate concept contained within the subject concept. So all triangles have three sides. All triangles is the subject concept, and having three sides is the predicate concept. The predicate concept, having three sides, is contained in the subject concept, triangles. Everybody following me? I'm just going to stop and make sure, because I know Kant is rough. Yes, no. Yeah. Okay, it's all good. It takes a while to grasp it. So an analytic proposition is a proposition, a sentence about the world, where the predicate concept is in the subject concept. So all triangles have three sides. Triangles, that's my subject concept, what the sentence is about. Having three sides is the predicate concept, and that's contained within the subject because triangles have three sides. See what I mean? Yeah, it does. Well, philosophy depends heavily on language, right? Don't worry, we'll get there. We'll get there. Maybe if we compare it to analytic statements, right? Or compare to synthetic statements. So synthetic propositions, um, well, yeah, I would say predicate describes the subject. So the predicate concept is encapsulated within the subject concept. So if triangle is is the subject, then the predicate having three sides is part of that larger concept of being a triangle. Like if being a triangle is a large circle, then having three sides, you could circle with a smaller circle within the larger circle being a triangle. So we can distinguish analytic propositions from synthetic propositions because synthetic propositions do not contain the predicate concept within the subject concept. So they tell us something new. The sentence, all triangles have three sides, doesn't tell us anything about the world. It only sort of displays the relationships between the subject and predicate concepts. Yeah, Brooke, exactly. All bachelors are unmarried. Bachelor here is the subject, and unmarried is the predicate. Exactly. But synthetic propositions tell us things about the world. So a synthetic proposition that I made up is the pants are purple. The pants, that's the subject concept. Purple is the predicate concept. How do you know if the pants are purple? You have to go and look at the pants. You have to you have to check and see whether someone is wearing purple pants. So that's a synthetic proposition. It tells us something new about the world. All right, now, whoa, went backwards by accident there. So typically, the way it goes is that our knowledge of synthetic propositions is a posteriori, after sense experience. Because think about it, you don't know what color the pants are unless you go and look. You have to actually check. So that's a posteriori knowledge. Kant wanted to know if we could have synthetic a priori propositions, because this would help him respond to what Hume says about cause and effect. Remember last time we learned about what Hume says about cause and effect. He says that there's nothing necessary about cause and effect. Rather, it's just a constant conjunction that our minds perceive. And that's kind of how he pulls the legs out from underneath the uniformity principle. There's nothing necessary about causality or that the future will be like the past. It's just that it happens to be like that, but we can't be certain of that. Kant had a problem with that. Kant was like, no, we have to fix this. How do we do it? Let's try and find a synthetic a priori proposition. So a thing that we can know with sense experience, or a thing that we can know prior to sense experience, but whose predicate concept is not contained within the subject concept. So Kant thought that we could. How? Well, this is where the Copernican revolution in metaphysics comes in. Kant argued that our mind organizes our experience of the world or structures our experience of the world. It does this using forms of sensible intuition and pure concepts of the understanding. See, Kant is Kant is not a rationalist or an empiricist. He is a transcendental idealist. So our mind has these innate mechanisms that impose structure on our experience. Oh, yes, there are absolutely contemporary philosophers writing about epistemology, certainly. We'll learn, actually, next time we're going to learn about a lot of the epistemology that was going on in the 20th century. Um, and in fact, my PhD supervisor was, well, he still is an epistemologist. So, yeah, absolutely, epistemology is still happening. Totally. It's just that Kant tried to address the disagreements between rationalism and empiricism by changing the way we think about what the mind actually does. You know, if you're a rationalist, you're like, oh, I can just use my natural light of reason, right? If you're an empiricist, you have to go out and look at the world. Kant comes along and says, your mind has these innate mechanisms that structure your experience of the world for you. Um, so there are forms of sensible intuition like space and time. So for Kant, he would say that space and time are empirically real, but transcendentally ideal. So things that happen out there in the world, sure, they happen in space and time, but space and time are also kind of like a filter in the mind through which events are presented to us. Likewise, with concepts of the understanding like quantity, quality, relation, and modality. So where Hume is like, oh, we can't know, there's nothing necessary when it comes to cause and effect. It's just this constant conjunction. Well, for Kant, he's like, well, hang on, Hume, we don't really know about causality through sense experience anyway. Rather, the mind organizes our experiences of the world causally. It's something that the mind structures our experience that way. That's what causality really is. Whoops. So that means for Kant, every event has a cause is a synthetic proposition that we can know a priori. It's a synthetic proposition because it tells us something about the world, but we can know it a priori because the mind uh, has these innate structure imposing ways of presenting information about the world to us. Think about it. If you look out the window, right? I'll look out the window and I've got a couple of lovely trees by my window. I don't just see blobby patches of green and brown and bits of blue peeking through the trees. It's not just a big perceptual mess. My mind imposes structure on my experience so that I see the two chestnut trees and the maple tree that are out there, not just a big mess of leaves and bark and whatnot, right? So the mind imposes structure on our experience. So every event has a cause is synthetic because um, has a cause is not contained within the subject concept event, but it's a priori because these mechanisms are innate. It's just the way the mind structures our experience. We cannot we cannot justify a priori knowledge with sensations or experience. So that means that we can never really know, or one of the consequences here is that we can never really know what the world is really like. You know, Plato thought that our world is mere appearances, but we can grasp the pure forms using the intellect alone. Kant would say all we really have are appearances. We can't know the things in themselves as they really are because the mind imposes structure on our when we perceive those things. It organizes them. We only see things as they appear to us in the mind. Kant discusses all of this in his critique of pure reason. It's one of the three critiques. You have the critique of pure reason, the critique of practical reason, and the critique of judgment. And note, this is important actually. In philosophy, critique means to analyze or to investigate. It doesn't mean to criticize in a colloquial sense, right? So if Kant is doing a critique or criticizing something, or if any other philosopher is doing the same, they're not saying it's bad, right? What they're doing is reasoning about it and analyzing it, investigating it, to try and understand it better. So what Kant is doing here is not saying pure reason is dumb. He's not doing that. He's trying to understand what exactly pure reason is. So that's what critique means in philosophy. All right, let's go on. So the Copernican revolution in metaphysics. How do we make sense of that? Well, let's talk about Copernicus. We'll get rid of that. So Copernicus, who knows about Copernicus and the Copernican revolution? Feel free to raise a hand or pipe up in the chat room. Good old Copernicus, Nicholas Copernicus. No idea. Oh, geez. It is a cool name. He was a Polish cleric who did natural philosophy as well. So natural philosophy, and he was particularly concerned with the motions of the heavenly bodies, or the planets and the stars. That's close. That's close. It's not the Earth being smaller than the sun. It's the Earth revolving around the sun. Rather, yeah. Okay, you guys got it. Yeah. So before Copernicus, we used something that we now call the geocentric model. And this goes all the way back to Ptolemy, who was a Greek scientist working in Egypt way back in the day after Alexander the Great conquered that area. Now, Ptolemy advocated a model of the solar system with Earth at the center and the sun and all the planets going around it. Now, Copernicus was like, wait a minute, what if that's wrong? What if the sun is at the center and all the celestial bodies go around the sun? That might help us make more sense of the motions of the planets. It's true that, yeah, Copernican derives from Copernicus. Yeah. Now, it's true that Ptolemy's model explained the motions of the planets reasonably well, but not perfectly. The problem was retrograde motion, right? If you look at planets over a period of months, they'll appear to move in the sky and then go backwards for a few weeks and then go back the other way again. Ptolemy explained this with the Earth at the center and positing that the planets are all on these celestial spheres, and it's the motions of all these spheres that causes this retrograde motion. Yeah, Mercury retrograde. That's because from Earth, it looks like for a little bit Mercury's going backwards, but it's not because the planet actually stops moving and goes backwards, right? It's because, as we later worked out, the relative motions of the Earth and the other planets as Earth goes around the sun, along with all the other planets. Ptolemy, again, explained this with like planets resting on celestial spheres that orbited around the Earth, and it was very complicated. Copernicus said, well, why don't we just put the sun in the center? Now, Copernicus's model only worked, it only worked just as well as Ptolemy's. It didn't work any better until we realized that planets go around the sun in ellipses, not perfect circles. But Ptolemy was right. I mean, no, Ptolemy was wrong. Copernicus was right. The Earth is not at the center of the solar system. The sun is. So what does Kant have to say about all that? He says, up to now, it has been assumed that all our cognition must conform to the objects out in the world, right? But all attempts to find something about them a priori through concepts that would extend our cognition have, on this presupposition, come to nothing. Hence, let us once try whether we do not get farther with the problems of metaphysics by assuming that the objects must conform to our cognition, which would agree better with the requested possibility of an a priori cognition of them, which is to establish something about objects before they are given to us. This would be like the first thoughts of Copernicus, who, when he did not make good progress in the explanation of the celestial motions, if he assumed that the entire celestial host revolves around the observer, tried to see if he might not have greater success if he made the observer revolve and left the stars at rest. Now, in metaphysics, we can try in a similar way regarding the intuition of objects. So, what Kant is saying is like, well, just how Copernicus thought that everything revolved around him, and then wasn't making any progress. So he made himself the one to revolve, as it were, and had better results that way. Why don't we make it, when it comes to a priori knowledge, not about the objects conforming, not about our cognition conforming to the objects, but about um, the objects conforming to our cognition. What does that mean, conforming to our cognition? Again, the mind via forms of sensible intuition and categories of understanding imposes structure on the things in themselves, the things that exist out there in the world, the noumenal things. The consequence is that we never know the way the world really is. We're always getting a sort of presentation of the world, a representation of the world, not the world itself directly. We know that the world exists out there, but that's all. Everything else is appearance, is how objects in the world appear to us as they are presented by the mind. So when I look at this cup, I'm not seeing the cup itself. This is a mental representation of the cup. It's not the actual cup. I only know this cup via the way the mind presents it to me. The coffee's still delicious, though. Yeah, in a sense, yeah. Kant is onto something here. But you have to be careful, because Kant is talking about the mind, not the brain. Right? And to us that might sound silly. We might say, what, the mind and not the brain? But the brain is the thing that does the mind, right? Yeah. But Kant is not concerned with how, like, what today we might say, how the mind is implemented. So minds are implemented or realized by brains. That's what most scientists think nowadays. But Kant's not concerned about those squishy, messy, gooey details. He's talking about the mind as a sort of I don't want to say information processing system, but as the thing we think with. But he's not concerned with the brain. But you're right. The brain also seems to construct a representation of the world. So it's a mental representation. I used to has anyone familiar with this painting? Let me find it for you before we continue. I'm not sure if we're going to finish this set of slides today, but that is okay. We can pick it up next time. I'm going to show you this painting here. Yeah, that's something you have to be careful of, right? It's like today we maybe think, oh, mind, brain, doop doop doop. We think of them as the same. Kant is not talking about the brain. he is talking about the mind. So that's something you always have to keep in mind, right? Here we go, the treachery of images. Come on, show me that image. I used to look at this and go, what? Like, what on earth does this mean? This is French. Ceci n'est pas une pipe. This is not a pipe. What? I'll cover those. I'll go back and cover those. For now, though, look at this painting by Magritte. Magritte. What is this? What on earth? What? Does this make sense? Yeah, you got it. I used to hate this thing. I used to be like, yeah, it's a pipe. What are you talking about? No, it's not a pipe. It's a representation of a pipe. Yeah, because it's I believe it's a painting. But yeah, it is not a pipe. It's a representation of a pipe. So, well, it could be, but we know for certain that it is meant to be a depiction of a tobacco pipe, right? Um, and then Magritte paints here. Well, it's not a pipe. This is not a pipe, and you're looking at it like, oh, what? But the title gives it away: the treachery of images. It's a representation of a pipe. In the same way, my perception of this coffee cup, it's not a coffee cup. It's a representation of a coffee cup. So that's what mental representations are. I don't know this one. Maybe you can share that in the chat. Is that another painting? I'm not. If it is, I'm not familiar with it. Here, let's get back to the slideshow, which I don't think we'll finish, but that's okay. That's okay. We should have time to catch up on Wednesday. So as I mentioned before, this view of Kant's is called transcendental idealism. If it sounds weird or hard to get your head around, don't worry about it. Kant takes a couple of tries to really grasp properly. And the Critique of Pure Reason is not an easy read. So just to cover, somebody had a question about the analytic synthetic distinction. Analytic statements or analytic propositions always have the predicate concept contained in the subject concept. So all squares have four sides is an analytic proposition. It's a statement that's analytic because squares, the subject predicate, the subject concept contains the predicate concept. The predicate concept has four sides. Likewise with bachelor, right? All bachelors are unmarried men. So the subject, bachelor, contains the concept unmarried men. So those are analytic statements. But synthetic statements, they don't contain their predicate concepts. So in my example is the pants are purple. The pants is the subject, but the subject concept pants does not contain any predicate concept like purple within the bare concept pants. You actually have to go and see whether a particular pair of pants is in fact the color purple. So does that clear it up? Well, anyway, for whoever asked that question, I hope that helps clear it up. Maybe we can finish. Oh no, we've only got 5 minutes. Well, maybe we can at least get into Quine. No, it's not about reality. Because remember, analytic statements don't really tell us about the world, right? Um, and it could be the case. Remember, a priori truths are true in every possible world. So even if every pair of pants in our world was purple, it could be the case in it could be the case that that might not have been, and pants could have been other colors, right? So if you're an empiricist, you say that analytic propositions are the only way to a priori that there is. Kant wouldn't say this, but an empiricist like David Hume would say, like, if you've got a priori knowledge, it's always of it's always of some kind of it's always because of the relations between concepts expressed in language, like all triangles have three sides. So only analytic propositions where the subject concept contains the predicate concept count as a priori knowledge. So these are like linguistic truths or conceptual truths. And everything that we come to know via the senses is a posteriori knowledge. So empirical knowledge is reflected in synthetic propositions like the pants are purple or the cat is on the mat. That's another one. That's another fun one. But Willard Van Orman Quine came along in the 20th century and published a really famous paper called Two Dogmas of Empiricism. And the first dogma of empiricism is that we can, in principle, there's a typo there, distinguish between analytic and synthetic propositions. So an empiricist is going to say, like, look, we can easily distinguish between analytic and synthetic propositions. Analytic are those that have a subject concept that contains the predicate concept. But synthetic propositions aren't like that. That's how we can tell the difference. But Quine in this paper tries to show that we actually can't distinguish between analytic and synthetic statements. And he does this by showing that empiricists are relying on circular reasoning. Analytic sentences, Quine says, are synonymous. They have synonymy. So triangle, for example, all triangles have three sides. So triangle and three-sided polygon are synonymous one another. They mean the same thing. So analytic statements are synonymous, and sentences that contain synonymous expressions are those that contain necessary truths. So an analytic statement, all triangles have three sides, is analytic because of synonymy. Three-sided, polygon, and triangle mean the same thing. And it's necessarily true by virtue of what those concepts mean that all triangles have three sides. So we know that analytic sentences have synonymy and that they are necessarily true. Which sentences are necessarily true? The analytic sentences. So now we've got a big old circle here, and that's a problem for Quine. Quine, in fact, would argue that, if we don't have this non-circular understanding of what it means to be analytic, what it means, for a proposition to be analytic, that is, then we can't understand what it means for a proposition to be synthetic either. So we actually don't have a good handle on the analytic-synthetic distinction. One consequence of this for Quine is that we could deny any analytic proposition if we make compensatory conceptual changes. Now, this is a controversial view. That's like saying, well, I can deny the truth of the sentence, all triangles have three sides, by just changing my concepts such that triangles have a different number of sides. Would that be reasonable? My intuition is that it wouldn't, but again, this is a controversial thing that Quine was doing here. Even if the boundaries here are fuzzy, thinkers like Paul Grice and Peter Strawson think the distinction between analytic and synthetic propositions is still quite useful. But we'll take a look at the second dogma when we cover the third chapter of our textbook. But for now, this is what you need to know about Quine, the first dogma of empiricism, is that we can tell the difference between analytic and synthetic statements. What Quine does is try to show that we don't really understand analytic statements. We say that analytic statements are the ones that have synonymy. So the concepts are synonymous one another. Sentences with synonymous concepts are necessarily true. Necessarily true is analytic. So it's a circle from analytic to synonymy to necessity back to analytic, and it's a circle. And we need some kind of outside justification for defining what an analytic proposition is, which we don't have. That's what Quine is saying. And because we don't understand the analytic proposition, what an analytic proposition is, we can't understand what a synthetic proposition is. So we don't have a good grasp of the analytic synthetic distinction. That's Quine, or some of what he says anyway. Okay, we're out of time, so we'll have to cover Kripke next time. Which is fine. We'll cover Kripke and then we'll move on to cover the next bit of the chapter. Yes, I'm in a Phil class because last week everything made sense. Yeah, no, get used to it. It's fine. You'll get it. You'll all get it. I know a lot of this is tricky to assimilate at first, but but it's all right. You'll survive. Sometimes it helps to take a second look at the readings after the lecture. The difference between knowledge necessary, well, we haven't gotten to knowledge yet, but necessary truths are truths that have to be true no matter what. They're necessarily true in all possible worlds. Could not have been the case that they're not true. A true belief is a belief you have that's true, and knowledge, as we'll see, is a well justified true belief. At least that's what we thought until Edmund Gettier came along. So thanks, everyone. Deduction and induction, we covered that last week. So we're running out of time. In fact, we're past time. But basically, deductive arguments are meant to be truth-preserving. So you start from some premises and follow the rules of reasoning through to a conclusion. And if your premises are true and you follow the rules, you're guaranteed to have a true conclusion. Induction is about going out and observing the world. So in a nutshell, that's the difference. But for fine details, I would review the material from last week. So thanks, everybody. I have to get going now. I hope you all have a good day, and I'll see you on Wednesday when we'll finish talking about knowledge. All right. Bye, everyone.